Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch as well as the conversations. My name is Kemi Jonah. I'm the Director of the Office of STEM Education Partnerships at Northwestern University, and I'm pleased to facilitate our keynote session this afternoon. Susan was very strategic in scheduling. This is normally the low energy moment after lunch, but we've saved our most exciting speakers in an attempt to counteract that effect. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, and the format will be we'll have both of our speakers offer their remarks, and we'll hold questions for both of them until the end, and then we'll have sort of a mini panel of Q&A. We have a significant block of time, and so I'm hopeful that we will have time for some thoughtful questions from the audience. We will again have the roving microphones, so please signal when you'd like that. It's my distinct honor today to introduce the two keynotes for our session today. As broader impacts professionals, many of us in this room often feel like the poor stepchildren of the NSF enterprise, toiling away in isolation and obscurity. And thus, it feels like a real validation of the importance of the work we are all doing to have these individuals make it a priority to be with us and take time out of their busy schedules to share their remarks. Our first speaker this afternoon is the newly appointed director of NSF, Dr. France Cordova. We are even further honored, as I just learned, to host the first public talk that Dr. Cordova has given since officially taking the reins at the beginning of this month. So, you can always stump your friends at Trivial Pursuit by asking a few years down the road to name the event that she first spoke at, and you'll ace it every time. Personally, I have to say that it is fortunate that I get to introduce her as NSF director rather than in her previous role as Chancellor of Purdue, where her Boilermakers would have represented a key Big Ten rival to my Northwestern Wildcats. Lucky for me. I cannot attempt to truly do justice to summarizing Dr. Cordova's highly distinguished career and still leave her any time to make her remarks, so I will direct you to the conference packet where we have printed a fuller bio for you to consult. What I think those of us in this room most recognize and appreciate is Dr. Cordova's twin passions for science and education, the two pillars of the broader impacts endeavor that we are all so passionate about. Her impressive leadership at Purdue and other institutions demonstrates her deep commitment to education. At Purdue, she is credited with leading the school to record levels of research funding, reputational rankings, and student retention rates. In particular, she was recognized for closing the retention gap between underrepresented minority students and the general student population to less than 2.5% from over 11%, which I think is a really significant accomplishment at a school the size of Purdue. And her accomplishments as a scientist point to her enduring passion for the scientific enterprise. Among her many other accomplishments as an observational and experimental astrophysicist, she became the youngest person and first woman to hold the position of NASA Chief Scientist and was later awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, NASA's highest honor. Please join me in welcoming NSF's new director, Dr. Frances Cordova.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Wanda Ward and Susan Reno for their great work in putting this summit together. NSF program reviews have always been keenly focused on intellectual merit, and that is something that is looked for, of course, in every proposal that's reviewed. but we have more recently given substantial weight to the broader impacts potential of those proposals. This summit is providing the tools and the guidelines needed to do that, and I think this gathering is a big step forward in clarifying what is meant by broader impacts. I'd also like to give a shout out to the moderator of this segment, Kemi Jonah. I've admired the important work Kemi has been doing at Northwestern in research projects involving STEM education, STEM curricula design, cyber learning, online learning models, and web-based education and outreach. So I appreciate very much your agreeing to be moderator of this segment. It's said that moderating any academic discussion is always a challenge. But focusing the energies of such wide-eyed firebrands as my good friend and National Science Board colleague, Alan Leshner, and myself, will no doubt test your diplomatic abilities. I'll make one promise to Kemi. I don't intend to take anywhere near the 40 minutes allotted to make my opening remarks. For one thing, Alan has already said that he will take that time. He wants to talk for the entire time so you don't have any time for questions. No, kidding. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, to engaging with you on developing the right ways to accomplish the broader impacts challenge. I'm more looking forward to your comments and your suggestions, frankly. And if I had one message I can impart to all of you, it would be that the work that we do today and in the days ahead will have a great impact on the future of federal funding support for scientific research. In a very real sense, tomorrow begins today, and I hope you'll keep that in mind as we engage in our discussion. So, of course, my personal view of things, which is shown on this slide, in that view, today began on April 2nd, just over 2 weeks ago, when I was sworn in as the 14th director of the National Science Foundation, and I am grateful to Dr. Leshner for sharing that moment with me. That's Office of Science and Technology Policy Head John Holdren on my left, and my cousin Adrian Cordova holding the Bible in the center. As you're no doubt aware, the confirmation process for me was long, affording me lots of time for reflection. So when it was finally concluded successfully, I was appreciative that my confirmation was greeted with this thoughtful article in Nature magazine. As you can see, the title neatly sums up some of the issues that this summit is wrestling with in terms of understanding the evolving focus of our stakeholder groups, in this case, Congress. The article had a quotation from Vint Cerf, also a good friend and colleague on the National Science Board, who observed, "The toughest challenge that the NSF faces right now is one that is faced by all research institutions that are funded by taxpayer dollars: relevance." I think Vint has identified a key word here: relevance. As a federal agency, we need to stay relevant with those who entrust us with taxpayer funds. We need to reach out to Congress and other stakeholders and be proactive in explaining what NSF is about and why we are vital to the nation's future. But relevance also has other aspects that we need to remind people about. One is time. What may seem of questionable relevance today can become extremely relevant later on, in fact, in a very short span of time. Think of the development of touchscreens and the subsequent explosion of smartphones and tablets. Or think of lasers, which were initially regarded as a technology in search of a problem. It didn't take long for lasers to become a miracle solution for ubiquitous applications in medicine and other fields. We must not lose sight of the National Science Foundation's obligation to explore the unexplored and inspire us with the wonders of discovery. That is relevant to what makes us human. NSF is more than an agency of government or a funding mechanism for the infrastructure of science. The work of NSF is a sacred trust that every generation makes to those of the next generation, that we'll build on the body of knowledge we inherit and continue to push forward the frontiers of science. For more than 6 decades, the core mission of NSF has been to support fundamental scientific research. As the only federal agency dedicated to the support of basic research and education in all fields of science and engineering, NSF empowers discoveries across a broad spectrum of scientific inquiry. The FY 2015 budget request for NSF is just under $7.3 billion. We emphasize the fact that ours is a very lean organization. About 94% of NSF funds are spent on supporting research, education, and facilities, meaning that the majority of our budget actually goes back to states and localities through the grants and awards we make. We receive about 50,000 grant proposals annually, from which the competitive merit review process will result in the funding of about 11,000 awards. NSF provides 24% of the total federal support of academic basic research in all science and engineering fields in the United States, and some 2,000 U.S. colleges, universities, and other institutions which receive our funding. Each year, NSF awards thousands of grants that engage the talents of about 300,000 researchers, postdoctoral fellows, trainees, teachers, students. That support is distributed among individuals and teams, centers, and major facilities across a broad array of disciplines. So I think you'll agree that its reach is very extensive. The result is fundamental scientific research that has had a profound impact on our nation's innovation ecosystem and kept our nation at the very forefront of the world's science and engineering enterprise. So let me return to the word that I raised earlier, relevance. One of the frustrations that every one of us in the room has encountered is that most people take for granted the NSF-funded breakthrough discoveries that have transformed our world. Not enough of our fellow citizens understand how relevant the research we've conducted is to their daily lives. So, in order to make the point with more emphasis, we developed this graphic that demonstrates how NSF-funded discoveries have made significant improvements in the life of a family. And you can tell me after you see this if this works for you. So, our typical family wakes up at 6 a.m. and takes enriched daily supplements, which NSF research has shown helps lead to better overall health. At 7 a.m., they may shower and shave with low-cost, low-energy clean water, made possible by improvements in water treatment identified by NSF research. At 8 a.m., they check the weather forecast, which has improved accuracy due to Doppler radar, an advance in meteorology made possible by the NSF-supported National Center for Atmospheric Research. At 9 o'clock and throughout the day, family members log on to computers, protected by enhanced cybersecurity, one of NSF's ongoing major priorities. At 10 a.m., mom gets an MRI exam that shows what's been causing the pain in her elbow. Early NSF-supported fundamental research led to the development of magnetic resonance imaging, and we've supported numerous MRI innovations since the 1990s. At 11, Dad checks out operations at the factory where he works, with robotics made possible by advanced manufacturing investments made by NSF. At noon, they take off a lunch hour to visit the farmer's market and buy nutrient-rich vegetables. At 1 p.m., grocery shopping is made more cost-effective by the use of universal barcodes, another advance that is directly attributable to NSF-funded research. At 2, children find their science and math classes more challenging and rewarding with advanced STEM educational techniques. NSF is in the vanguard of STEM education, funding numerous projects every year. At 4 in the afternoon, the family attends CSI, The Experience, an interactive forensic science exhibit available at selected science museums. The exhibit was developed with the input of the hit TV show and is one example of NSF's investment in informal science education. And then at 5, the family heads home, their trip made safer by airbag improvements enabled by NSF investments. At 7 p.m., Mom and Dad work on various tasks with their electronic tablets, with the human-machine interaction improved by NSF-funded research. At 8, the whole family goes outside to gaze at the blood moon rising. How many of you saw that? Quite impressive, wasn't it, last night? They are inspired by the vastness of the universe. This particular entry holds special relevance for an astrophysicist like me. It was my early experiences with the night sky that led to my asking, why are there stars? How are they formed? These questions, and many more that tumbled out of my childhood wonder, led to my own pursuit in astronomy. At 10 o'clock, or filling your own favorite time, the children drift off to sleep. Perhaps unaware that NSF research has proven a good night's sleep boosts children's cognitive performance, Mom and Dad are simply happy that another day has drawn to a close. We've now seen an around-the-clock picture of the many contributions NSF makes to one family's well-being. So how's that for relevance? If we can get across the true picture that the many significant contributions that NSF-funded research has made to Americans' health, security, education, and economic well-being, not to mention to their sources of inspiration, that will go a long way to help building support for future research funding. We want to get the message across that federal support for scientific research and education will fuel innovation and provide untold benefits to Americans for decades to come. So, what's possible? Speaking in broad themes, we're only constrained by the limits that we place on our innate human curiosity. It was that curiosity that inspired an international coalition called BICEP2 for background imaging, cosmic extragalactic polarization, to search for evidence of the cataclysmic events following the Big Bang. NSF helped fund the collaborative program, including funding the team's telescope at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. About a month ago, the BICEP2 researchers announced they had collected what they believe is the first evidence for cosmic inflation. Inflation is the cataclysmic event in which, in a fleeting fraction, namely 10 to the minus 30th of a second following the Big Bang, an infant universe expanded exponentially, stretching far beyond the view of the best telescopes. So think about that. Until the BICEP2 results were announced, inflation was a theory, a nice, solid theory, but a theory. And now, using data gathered by the NSF-funded telescope and lots of researchers located from coast to coast, the collaboration has described what it says are the first direct observational evidence of inflation. The collaboration's researchers also believe that they have seen the fingerprints of gravitational waves or ripples in space-time. And this confirms a deep connection between two very powerful theories, quantum mechanics and general relativity. These waves have been described as the first tremors of the Big Bang. Astronomers have been searching for that evidence for decades since the theory of inflation was first proposed, and NSF funding helped make it possible for teams to finally discover that evidence. Now I'd like to close by noting that your visit to Washington comes at a crucial time for scientific research. Actually, I think it's always been a crucial time for scientific research. And your visit and your timing right now is all part of that continuum of educating everyone about the importance of science. In an increasingly constrained fiscal environment, we're redoubling our efforts to communicate what we're doing on the broader impacts, specifically better explaining our merit funding review process, demonstrating that we're acting at the agency as wide stewards in investing taxpayer dollars. And one way we're doing that, of course, is with all of your help in the merit review process. We've been asking our stakeholders, PIs and institutions like yours that receive NSF funding, to help improve the ways that we explain research priorities and objectives. I think probably at your institutions you all have that star that is rising, that can really explain well the benefits of scientific research and can be role models for new generations of students, and hopefully you're cultivating many, many of those individuals. We all need to be public advocates for science and engineering. We need to speak about the contributions of federal investments to research and discovery. We need to illustrate the ways we're influencing new generations of researchers, expanding both their number and their diversity, so that the science and engineering core is filled with people with lots of different backgrounds and perspectives. In both formal and informal venues, we need to engage the public in order to help improve understanding of the value of basic research and why our projects are worthy of investment. Ultimately, as you know, all our elected representatives are elected, and it's the public that elects them and puts their trust in them. And if we want to ensure that our officials know what the public values, then we have to reach out to that public. And so that's what I enjoin all of you to help me do. And I want to make as a centerpiece of my NSF directorship that outreach. And it's not done by single individuals, as you know. It's done by all of us in our own special, unique ways in very different venues, strung all around this country, making that case in ever new and powerful ways, and continuing to make it. BICEP 2 shows us that we need to keep looking for evidence because it has left its mark and it wants to be detected. It's just a great example of our search for our origins and how they connect to our present, to the young people that we've raised and the tools that we have put there to make those kinds of amazing discoveries. The joy of discovery is what we as scientists and researchers pursue every day of our lives. I felt it first when I was a young girl looking up at the night sky, and I still feel it every day. That sense of wonder is something that we never want to lose. And in our talk about relevance, again, understanding that the meaning of that word in all its dimensions, it also means that what is relevant to the human experience is that worth pursuing, and that has many, many different guises. So, as I said, I'll be sharing that thought with everybody that I meet, and I hope that you'll share it with me. As we look forward, we want the foundation to continue to play a vital role in ensuring that our great United States remains at the forefront of scientific research and discovery, investing in the best people, in the best ideas. In other words, investing in you. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. I will remember to say when people ask me, have you, 6 years from now, did you ever receive a standing ovation? I say, yes, at my first talk at the Broader Impact Summit.
So in other words, you're 1 for 1. I hope the record continues. Thank you very much, Dr. Cordova. Again, we'll ask that you jot down any questions that you might have for Dr. Cordova, and then we'll convene a Q&A session at the end of after our next speaker. So our next keynote speaker is Dr. Alan Leshner, Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or for those of us who have to make these introductions, AAAS for short. Dr. Leshner is one of the country's leading experts on drug addiction. Prior to AAAS, he was the director of the National Institutes on Drug Abuse and held senior leadership positions at NIH, the National Institutes of Mental Health, and of course also at NSF. In addition to being a distinguished scientist and leader, Alan is passionate about ensuring that Americans better understand science and that scientists better understand what the public wants and needs from them. This is the same passion that drives our commitment to the Broader Impacts enterprise, and the very reason that over 100 of us have made the trip here today, some from as far away as Europe and Alaska. In fact, Alan has argued that AAAS has an obligation to inform the public and policymakers about what science is showing about any issue of modern life. This nicely articulates the tight alignment between the work of AAAS and the broader impacts community here in this room. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Leshner.
I could just use Dr. Cordova's slides. They're actually better than mine. All right. Go ahead. Kill that. That's me. I got it. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And it's actually an honor and a privilege to be sharing the podium with my friend and colleague, particularly on her maiden speech, so to speak. And I'm going to use a whole lot of slides and a lot of words to give you a basically totally consistent message with the message that Dr. Cordova gave you. And I have to say I'm particularly delighted by her clear commitment to public outreach, public understanding, public engagement with science, because as some of you may know, this has been an obsession of mine for over 30 years that I've been in Washington. Hard to believe they let me stay that long. So when I was first invited to speak, I was actually asked to speak about the NSB Task Force on Merit Review. And if any of you haven't memorized the report, I'm actually going to run through rather rapidly, so don't feel compelled to read all the words on the slides. A bit about the history of what the task force was about. And then I'm going to talk some more about my own views about broader impacts and about the need for the kind of work that we're all committed to. So very rapidly, and these are even NSF slides, the task force was established in the spring of 2010, and it was established in recognition of the fact that the merit review criteria had not been revisited for 13 years. And we wanted to make sure that they were, in fact, still applicable. But I have to say that a more strenuous driver of it was the fact that so many people said they couldn't figure out what broader impacts was about, what they were supposed to do, and how that criterion was going to be used in evaluating either their projects or their institutions' projects. So our task force was charged with looking at them, their effectiveness, and how well they were being implemented on both sides, both from the investigators who were submitting proposals and from the science administrators, the science leaders in the government who had to make decisions using them. So the issues that we were asked to look at, I think, are the obvious one: what's good, what's bad? How are they being used? What's the role of the institution? I stuck that in the charge. I'll come back to that. Have the criteria had an impact on the way PIs think about shaping their research projects? And then how are you going to figure out whether they were worthwhile doing? We interviewed everybody. We talked to everybody, mostly the staff of the National Science Board, who were fantastic on this project. Did most of this interviewing and analyzing, including analyzing, as you can see, 195 committee of visitor reports, and then gazillion proposals, in order to get a sense of how, in fact, this concept was being used, how it was being construed. At the same time, the America Competes Act was being reauthorized. That's the authorization, as you all know well, for NSF, for OSTP, for NIST, and the 2010 version was coming up, and it came at an interesting time because there was, candidly, some pressure on the task force actually to just say, let's not have a broader impacts criterion because it's annoying and difficult to contemplate. And the America Competes Act made very clear, sorry, you'll have one. And it, as you can read, did, however, say to NSF that NSF needed to develop a higher level of clarity about how the criterion was to be used and how it was to be used both by the PI and by NSF staff. So we looked at the criteria, and you can read as well as I, the intellectual merit criterion, well-defined, clearly understood, working really well. And then two concepts came up as needing clarification. I won't take time to dwell on them now, but one of them was the concept of potentially transformative. The other was how to deal with, how to handle the qualifications of the proposer within it. Let me just say that the word transformative was invented by another task force that I happen to be on. It started out as being the concept of high-risk, high-payoff research, but in Washington you're not allowed to say high-risk anything, right? It's got to be. And actually there was a lot of discussion at that time, we can have a different talk on this, that some unnamed leaders at NSF felt that they had to argue that everything NSF supported was transformative. And of course, we all know that research progresses in two ways, right? Some of it is transformative, sadly very little that I did, but very little transformative research very little research is truly transformative. Most of it's incremental, and incremental's fine. That's the basis for a lot of scientific advance, and it's a rare event. However, the rare events, and I can tell you, having given money out for 22 years, it's very difficult to get the peer review system to urge funders to fund truly transformative, high-risk, high-payoff research, because if you don't have a lot of money, why not play it safe? Anyway, we could talk about that some other time. Broader impacts was viewed as much more problematic. The good part is the intent of it is good, and it ought to be that there's a connection between scientific research and its impact on the rest of society, and I'll come back to that point again later. On the other hand, virtually everybody said the guidance is unclear, both in terms of what it is you needed to propose, and secondly, how it was going to be evaluated and how it was going to be weighed anyway. So some other stuff that we observed was that intellectual merit was typically given more weight than broader impacts during review, but that it wasn't consistent across different disciplines or across different parts of the NSF. The methods for assessing intellectual merit were pretty adequate. I don't know why that doesn't say publishing in Science and no other journals, but never mind. But the fact is that the assessment of broader impacts and the broader impacts criterion is very difficult. And that last point, I think, is a very important one, that many people believe that the institutions needed to be doing more to support the PI's efforts relating to broader impacts, and I would argue that's probably still true today. So our recommendations are pretty general. The two criteria do a good job capturing the major elements that should guide the evaluation of NSF proposals. There was a great need to clarify the description of the broader impacts criterion and how it's implemented, and there ought to be a set of core principles that overlay both criteria. Principles: all projects should be of the highest quality and have the potential to advance, if not transform, the frontiers. That was to make people who argued that everything was transformative happy. And then in the aggregate, and I added the term in the aggregate so I can explain that to you in more detail if you misbehave, but the idea was not to ask necessarily that every single project have a very clear, broader impact, but rather to make sure that in the aggregate, the work would in fact accomplish broader goals. And that, I think, is difficult to evaluate at times, but is an important point. Again, that the activities should be either related to specific projects or through other activities that are complementary to the project. And we can come back to that too. This is an important issue about how to do assessment because it's very difficult to assess every individual project, particularly in terms of broader impacts. Many projects are very important projects, but the magnitude of their effect won't be seen for a very long time, including on the rest of the world. And we made the argument, and I'll come back to this again, that the effectiveness of broader impact activities may best be done at a higher, more aggregated level, and that includes at the institutional level. So these are the two criteria. They're the same ones that there were before, basically. And then both criteria should have these elements considered. What's the potential to advance knowledge and benefit society? To what extent do the activities suggest and explore creative, original, or potentially transformative concepts? Is the plan good? And this should be true whichever criterion one is looking at. You know, is the plan good? How qualified is the individual? And are there adequate resources available to the PI to get it done? We then argued NSF should come up with a detailed implementation plan, should be clear and consistent, and I think both Dr. Cordova and I would be interested to know whether you think the way in which NSF has responded is in fact clear enough, because obviously you are the experts. And my question to you, therefore, I made that on their slide, so I probably screwed it up somehow. How's it done in clarifying it? And I really am not qualified to answer that question. I want to emphasize 2 points for broader impacts. First of all, the impact and evaluation could be viewed at the institutional level. That is to say, it ought to be possible, or it ought to be entertainable, if that was English, for an array of projects to be synergistic with each other, and then you evaluate the aggregate of them, rather than forcing every single project to have a measurable impact in the broader sense. And the second is that we very carefully left the targets for broader impacts more ambiguous than at least people believed the targets to be in the past. And I'll take a minute and focus on that. This is the point about assessment, and we were very specific about it, just repeating it. And let me try to go a bit broader. So, as we were working on the project, as I mentioned, the 2010 America Competes Act was in play, and it declared there shall be a broader impacts criterion. And it actually put it in stone and took out of the discussion whether or not there ought to be one. Many in the scientific community, as you may be aware, you must be aware, quietly prayed every night that the broader impacts criterion would dissolve. And that Reauthorization Act specified a list of impacts that would count. And they were clearly articulated, and I'll show you in 1 minute the list that our task force came up with, and they were intentionally different because we didn't feel that the Congress should be dictating in such a high level of detail what the outcomes should be of NSF-funded research, because then we feared that the investigators would feel constrained by that. And so we went to great efforts to make the point that the list of exemplars were to be examples. They weren't meant to be delimited. There's, of course, obvious overlap, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but the point was to have clear examples of the kinds of things, but we must have said it 4 times, that it was just a list of examples, and hopefully your colleagues and PIs are not, over faithfully trying to go through and match them. We now have on the table the new FIRST Act that is probably consuming a large part of Dr. Cordova's waking hours now that she has inherited it. And it's had some controversy around it because, among other things, it requires a formal determination by the responsible foundation official as to why, A, the project ought to be funded, and second, how it's in the national interest, and specifies the national interest. It's interesting that that is being proposed to be an overlay after normal peer review, which is sort of a big change in the way in which NSF does business. I will, however, point out and emphasize that, I don't see a laser pointer, but I'm sure there is one, but I just don't know how to work it there. That last possibility, promotion of the progress of science, adds a tremendous amount of leeway. And I think the intent of this act, really, this portion of the act, is to ask the question, why are you funding it? Be very clear about why you're funding it. And one of the reasons can be promoting the progress of science. Okay, so let me give you, I made that. Do you like that? Here, I'll show you again. So I thought I would take the last bit of time and just reflect some of my own thoughts about it. Am I talking too long? Am I all right? You okay?
No.
You're not bored yet?
I am okay.
Okay.
I'm not talking too long.
All right. Okay. My first observation is simple. Broader impacts is here to stay. The exact format and accounting or accountability will vary over time, but the public will always want assurance that their money is being well spent, and that's defined as spent well in their interest, not our interest. I do, however, believe that the responsibility for broader impacts is a responsibility for the host institution as well as for the individual. And that is something that is not well reflected in many of the institutions that many of us know well. Of course, not yours, they have you. And, do you like that? The degree of tie to explicit goals has varied and will always vary. You did not enjoy that enough. When I was in the government, I had like 5 people whose sole function was my life, and therefore they made all my slides. I make all my own slides now. Thank you. So I expect appreciation for anything that's sort of nifty. But anyway, this issue of the tie to goals has always been in place. In fact, a funny story, in the early 80s, I was asked to give a talk, actually at a AAAS meeting, on sort of the tension between centrally planned research, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. And I was, saying, oh, things have changed, now there's much more pressure to have science tied to national needs, and in the good old days, you could just let 1,000 flowers bloom and do whatever you want. An elderly gentleman in the front row raised his hand and said, Sonny, I was the science advisor to President X, and let me tell you, there were no good old days. They always wanted us to account for why should you pay for it. And the truth is, we do owe it to the public to explain what they're doing, but the pressure on how tied it has to be, or how tied your explanation, how clear your explanation has to be, has varied over time. And my point of view is, it's not inappropriate. There's nothing wrong with the public asking the question, what am I getting for this? Why would you want to do this? And at the risk of insulting somebody, there's an old saying that well, I think my next slide says this. Yeah. Some scientists do what they do because it's interesting and provocative, but society only supports science because it advances the state of humankind. If we only supported science because it was interesting and provocative, the NSF budget would look more like the National Endowment for the Arts, or the National Endowment, that's the insult. But you get the point, that because there is a clear tie to the advancement of humankind, the public is willing to support science, not just because it's cute. And the fact that an individual scientist may do what he or she does for that reason is nice, but that's not from a societal point of view. This is my favorite quote in the world. Public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And I think that's the message that we all need to carry with us, including our colleagues in the scientific community. Okay, I just said that. Now, the question is, what's a reasonable answer? And I tried to think up what I could think up of what appropriate answers would be, tied to advancing a particular need. You can read as well as I, building the infrastructure of science. If it's a critical scientific issue, it ought to be that this is part of a progression of scientific studies, not a standalone study. Who can defend some of the standalone studies that all of us do, unless they're part of a discipline, a long-standing, and then serving some other? This is the one I hate. It cannot be, trust me, basic research has been good for you, and it will be good for you in the future. That doesn't sell, and as a taxpayer, I actually wouldn't buy it, because there are some things that may not be so good and so useful. Sorry. Okay. I think a lot of the issue, though, really has to do with broader public understanding, and it's why I was so pleased to hear Dr. Cordova, because I think our thoughts about this appear to resonate. That is, a lot of the issue lies in a broader public understanding, and I think that requires an adjustment in how scientists engage with the public, including when they're doing broader impact activities. I'm not trying to argue that the utility has to be patently obvious. It doesn't. Innovative ideas are supposed to be odd. They're novel by definition. That's what innovation means. You didn't think of it before. But the reason we're supporting it should be understandable. And I think in order to do that, we have to shift how we approach the public and policymakers. So our attitude in the scientific community is that all we need is more public education or communication about science, and that's actually true, of course. That's a truism. But I think we have to get more nuanced. In many cases, the right approach is just traditional public communication or education. You know, if you just want to share the excitement or make some, fulfill some requirement or get more public support, share the excitement does work. But often the topics that we're studying are more complex and they're more controversial when they're met by the public. So I'm a neuroscientist. I worked for many years both in mental health and in drug abuse and addiction, although I did give up drugs. And when you're working in issues like that, simple public education in the traditional sense is not enough, because a lot of what science is showing conflicts with people's either core values, their beliefs, their peer group beliefs. I've just been through a lot of stuff around climate, and you know, we sort of bang our heads on the table and say it over and over, you know, human-induced climate change is true and it's going to hurt you, and people go, not true. That tension comes about in large part because what we're saying conflicts with what their peers believe, or it conflicts with what their colleagues believe. Anyway, and you need a different approach. The approach we advocate, I like this point, I'm going to say it, even though I was about to go past it. The core issue that I'm trying to make is that education by itself isn't going to do it, because it's not just lack of understanding. Often it's the case, embryonic stem cell research is my favorite example, where people do get it. That is, when surveys are done and people are asked, do you believe embryonic stem cell research will lead to new therapeutics and diagnostics? Overwhelmingly, yes. Do you want us to do embryonic stem cell research? Overwhelmingly, half say no. Why is that? It has to do with a conflict between their view of when life begins, and it's much more complicated. So the point is, they get it. They understand it, they don't like it, and they're not stuck with it. Only we're stuck with it. And that means that we need a different strategy. Just explaining, just we'll tell them again, doesn't work. And the different approach is called public engagement. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's a shift from communicating at the public to communicating with the public. And my view is that the scientific community has to do a much better job of listening to the public about their concerns, their priorities, and questions they'd like us to answer. This will have inflamed somebody. And we need to find common ground where we can, but we have to persist until we find it. Now, the problem is that it's not easy. First of all, many scientists, as you know better than I, are not equipped to speak about their work with the public and should not be allowed out in public. Sorry. Just a quick story. So I've worked around public understanding of science for 30-some years, and when I first came to AAAS, I was invited to be on a panel on public understanding, and the person speaking before me was the newly elected president of an unnamed scientific society beginning with the initials FASEB, and he said his presidency would be devoted to every member speaking to their neighbors about their work, and I wasn't aware the microphone was on, and I whispered, God forbid. And it's actually a learned skill. We at AAAS have a whole program in how to communicate science, and I won't spend time on it, but there's a dedicated website, and we go out to universities with a flying squad, and we train scientists how to communicate with the public. The National Academy of Sciences has now had 2 Sackler Symposia dedicated to the topic. It's a learned skill. It's not a natural art. And what it is we're talking about is complicated. I won't go through that. These are just a couple of the principles of it, and then I'll stop. So the first thing is that scientists, these are just examples of what scientists need to learn that you could help them with. So the first is that communicating to the public and to scientists is exactly the opposite. Scientists like to tell a story. You know, we begin with, once upon a time there was a theory, and from the theory a hypothesis was devised. And then we go through all this detail, and by the 27th page, you get to the point of what you found. The public wants the bottom line. Then you can go back and tell them all the other stuff, but if you haven't captured their attention, you're dead. This one was a lesson I learned very hard. The gist of the message is all that matters. You don't get any clauses or caveats. I'm actually one of the people who brought you schizophrenia as a brain disease. I also brought you addiction as a brain disease. I'm sort of Johnny One Note, but my scientific colleagues didn't like that. So I always said, addiction is a brain disease, comma, expressed in behavioral ways and in a social context. Nobody ever heard anything but addiction is a brain disease. Got a lot of mileage out of it, but nonetheless, no caveats, no clauses. This one always inflames scientists. Scientists, unfortunately, are people, but if you're going to be communicating as a scientist, stick to the facts, leave your values out of it, even though policies are made on the basis of facts and values. As a scientist, you are not entitled to express your values. That will have inflamed somebody. Don't harangue the public. This one I really like. Credibility is conferred by the audience, not the speaker. I got that at the Sackler Symposium. I don't remember who said it. This is the only word you will leave here with, from what I've said. So glocal means that people only care about things that are personally or locally meaningful. Therefore, the first task is to make whatever it is you're talking about personally meaningful to the individual, right? Global, local, get it? This one I just love to put on. If you're really working on something, engagement works better. So like that. The big town hall meetings we all like to have. When I was the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I held 14 town meetings around the country. Typically, they consisted of a bunch of scientists giving little talks, and then the extreme points of view would grab each of the two microphones and they'd yell at each other for the remainder of it. It is not a good technique for public engagement. And of course, communication has to work both ways. My view is if we are going to make, I didn't make this, if we're going to make any progress at all as a scientific community in the coming era, we have got to align where we are, the public is, and policymakers. And that's what I advocate. Thank you.
Oh, you got a mini standing ovation. You missed it.
I take whatever.
Don't blink. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Leshner and Dr. Cordova, for, I think, some truly inspiring messages, and I think we have a lot of sore thumbs from all the tweeting that was going on, so definitely some take-home messages. So now we have almost an hour, maybe 45 minutes. For some questions, and I'm sure that we will have a very sustained dialogue here. So please signal to the microphone carriers. There's Amy's in the back, and Megan's over here. And just from a protocol perspective, please let our distinguished panelists know who you are and what organization you're with, so that we can all appreciate the diversity of perspectives here. And if your question's directed at one or the other or both, please so indicate. So let's open up the floor.
While people are
Yeah.
gathering, I don't tweet, so will somebody tweet NSF to cancel my first town hall meeting, please?
No, note to self. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, please, stand up.
Hello, my name is Gail Scowcroft. I'm at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. And thank you both, Dr. Cordova and Dr. Leshner, for your comments. Fairly hopeful comments, I think, for many of us in this room. And for you, particularly Dr. Cordova, to hear that bringing science to the public, both in informal and formal ways, is going to be central to your leadership is extremely hopeful. When the broader impacts criterion hit the deck a couple of decades ago, it was expected that scientists with an individual research project would figure out a way how to do it. And we soon learned that that didn't work very effectively. And NSF spent about 15 years supporting programmatic opportunities that allowed scientists to plug into effective broader impact activities. And over the last couple of years, funding within the scientific directorates for those effective broader impact activities has diminished quite significantly. And the funding has moved over to EHR for education research, which is obviously very important too, but we have some lessons that we've learned, and I'm hoping that under your leadership, you could consider the needs of the scientific community for those kinds of opportunities, those innovative, broader impact, programmatic opportunities, again, as we move into the future. So if you could comment, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a very valuable insight. I certainly remember well all the activities on campuses, and they were really addressing Alan's concern that a lot of scientists were just ineffective if let out on their own. And so they did plug into units that were very well led on campus by people that understood this at a much deeper level, what would connect and how to connect. I have not, I don't know anything about the funding. You know better than I that it's dropped off or whatever. There are many, many good ways to approach this, and that is certainly one. One might want to address some of Alan's concern to bring the scientists more in, rather than just a plug-in like an electric car, that people were actually trained in the way he was talking about the AAAS having these workshops and going on campus and that sort of thing. So that's all things to evaluate, and you said there is evaluative research on the plug-in concept, but I think all models need to be looked at and are appropriate in different circumstances, and so I will definitely pledge to take a better look. I do think that one of the things Alan was saying is that individual scientists simply need to become more skilled at doing this, and we can talk about exactly how that would work out, is just an imperative. And let me give you an example of, so I was on a board before I joined NSF where there was a person on the board who was very wealthy and made lots of great contributions to all sorts of causes. And when you just talk to that person, you think, boy, that's a really quiet, kind of introverted person. You know, we all know them. Maybe we are them. And when that person would stand up in front of an audience this size, using no notes, and just spoke from the heart about why he was philanthropic and the history of how that evolved and his connection to American history and how that moved him and motivated him to fund the things he did, that you could have heard a pin drop in the room. And I just think it's a big lesson, and I'm not sure, to your question, how one learns it and when you learn it, at what point. But for everybody to learn how to that we all, no matter whether we're an introvert or an extrovert or something on the broad spectrum in between, we have a way of telling our story if we just put down the notes and try to connect with people, because inside we know why we're doing what we're doing. We know what motivates us, and we know the beauty of the truth that we're trying to address. So let's look into the models, see what's worked in the past, what works now. I'd love to see the evaluative research, because you did say, and that's very important, that NSF doesn't have all the money in the world to fund every activity. What it should be doing is funding pilot activities, evaluating them very well, and then transporting those best models and working through places like the AAAS and many organizations that do have other kinds of funding to promulgate those things that work.
No, I agree exactly. The only point I re-emphasize, because I think Dr. Cordova explained it extremely well, is actually it doesn't matter whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. I'm an extrovert, if you couldn't tell. And I had to learn. These are acquired skills, and it's fine that it's an acquired skill. You don't have to be born able to talk about gravity waves to the public. But it is learnable, and it needs to be learned, and I believe that institutions have an obligation to help teach their scientists how to do it.
Go ahead in the back, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm David Blockstein with the National Council for Science and the Environment, and I'm here as a representative of NSF's Advisory Committee on Environmental Research and Education. Interdisciplinary approaches to research and education are often intrinsically incorporating or representing broader impacts. And NSF has certainly increasingly supported interdisciplinary approaches, such as more recently through the Science and Engineering and Education for Sustainability Initiative. Yet we, as the advisory committee, have observed that there's still plenty of challenges in implementing interdisciplinary approaches through the disciplinary directorate structure of NSF. And I should say parenthetically that we are, as a committee, quite concerned about what's going to happen with the SEAS initiative. But I guess more broadly, I'm interested in knowing each of your perspectives in terms of NSF's role in supporting interdisciplinary research and education, and how NSF should continue to work to advance interdisciplinary approaches to science. Thank you.
Why don't you start?
So I think NSF does the very best job in the world of supporting interdisciplinary research. It doesn't mean that it isn't still, to some degree, bound by disciplinary review committees. And I collect sayings. I wrote an editorial in Science once about the demise of disciplinary research, because I think everything eventually will be multidisciplinary, trans, whatever word you want. But NSF has done unquestionably the best job of any funding agency I've seen. And I'll give you a very concrete example of what's going on right now. So the BRAIN initiative, I'm a neuroscientist, what do you expect? The BRAIN initiative is the first major neuroscience initiative ever in the United States. It just went from 100 to 200 million, which in our business is a lot of money. NSF has stood out for articulating a very clear multidisciplinary role where, in fact, you have the convergence of engineering and neuroscience and computer science and computation all brought together. And if you listen to their description of what they're interested in, it's absolutely the epitome of interdisciplinarity. And my own view is, although, you know, it would be nice if we could have only one directorate called science, that's not feasible from a practical point of view. But my own view is that NSF has done a better job, certainly a better job than NIH, where I worked for 13 years.
It's interesting that Alan picked that example, because that would be exactly the example I picked. And the reason why that works is because it didn't start with the mandate, thou shalt be interdisciplinary, because then everybody goes, duh, you know, what about my physics? What about my chemistry, my biology? It started with, hey, you know, we have this thing called the brain that drives everything that we do, including our well-being and connected to our hearts and our motor functions and so on. What do we know about it? What do we understand? And then the physicist wakes up and said, oh, I see some networks there, and the chemist said, and you know, it's about molecules, and the biologists, of course. And so that's what, when you start from what's the big question, then all the expertise converges, and people want to start addressing that question using their different perspectives. So I will give you another example from my own background. And when I was at NASA, the administrator just got possessed with astrobiology, because we finally had the tools a couple decades ago to actually ask questions. Are there other suns that have planets around them? What are these weird little creatures on our own planet that are living in extreme temperatures or extreme pressures at the bottom of the ocean, and extreme cold in Lake Vostok and Antarctica and so forth? And you saw the birth of a whole new field that involved the chemists and the biologists and the astronomers and the paleontologists and the ocean and deep drilling, et cetera. But it was because the question was profound. You know, are we alone? One of the really profound questions, just like brain research is. So if you ask the big questions, they have to necessarily, calling all, you know, interdisciplinary folks, we need you right here. So that's the way around, and that's why it's been a success at NSF, because we do fund all fields of science and engineering. So those folks are there, and they respond to that call.
Martin?
Martin Storkstick, National Academy of Sciences. I really like the idea of taking more of an institutional approach and not letting individual scientists struggle with something they're not trained to do. And as you can see here, is a community that can support them. I want to go to the tail end of that, which is when decisions are made on panels about whether grants are really worthy funding on the intellectual merit and the broader impact. And the question, as we all know, is when decisions are made of that kind, the voice that's in the room is very powerful. And so the degree to which people who actually know something about how to do broader impact well and have empirical evidence on the theories and so on and so forth, and how this can be done, and even know how to evaluate it, having in the room on panels that make decisions might be quite important. I'm not quite sure how to make that happen, and not overstretch a community like this one and bring in the experts for this, but it seems like a pretty simple step that's oftentimes missing. I sometimes get proposal post-hoc, or I'm not quite sure when, to say, well, does this make sense? And it's probably a little late and not as much of an impact on that. And by the way, the weird little creatures, Dr. Cordova, that you mentioned, immediately I thought you meant us, but you know, from the outside looking on us being swallowed by little metal cases that drive around. And anyway, but so the question of how this can be brought into the direct review process at NSF might be an important way to address the issue.
What's worth thinking about and asking our assistant directors how they see that process unfolding. I have to say I've spent my first 2 weeks reading quite a number of proposal reviews. It's all related to Alan's discussion about the first act and some proposals that have been singled out. And so I thought, I'll just look at the reviews myself. And every reviewer does address intellectual merit and broader impact. So I've been really impressed. They all have. Now, whether they do a good job, and then there's a synthetic review of all the reviews. And that one does a really good job because they're putting together. So maybe reviewer A and D didn't hit it so well, but when you get 10 or 12 reviews altogether, you do, and you are responsible for writing the statement, the final review, the summary review they call it. They do pull together all the broader impact reviews and all the intellectual merit. And so I just want to assure you that that process goes on. But I think the deeper part of what you were asking is, are people happy that the best thinking is present when people are addressing both aspects of that? We know they can do intellectual merit or they wouldn't be on that review panel. But how much have they been trained to look at what constitutes broader impact and include all those different factors that you were describing, that long list of what can constitute broader impact? So I will ask about that and pay attention to it. Thank you.
I would just make the comment that there are so many different ways that you can meet broader impacts, and you're talking about a relatively small community of experts. If you're talking about people with expertise in communicating with the public, they're not necessarily the researchers who study communicating with the public, right? We won't go into that. But it's a small number of people, and if you break it up into each of those different domains, you have, 9 people. You can't ask them to be on every panel. So, your point's well taken. There ought to be people who know something about it. But hopefully you all can help educate your own colleagues back in your institutions. But I think it's very tough.
Alan brought up, and you reminded me by saying the word communication, and he definitely brought this up in his talk, how important it is that we all, starting at the proposal stage, better communicate through our titles and our abstracts what it is we're doing. And I think you've probably seen a lot of things in the ether about that. But there are changes being made now by the, starting with the assistant directors through all the directorates on really making people, namely division leaders, program directors, responsible for educating the proposers that somebody is going to read this. I mean, think about congressmen. Well, think about their staff, because think about their staff going through and reading your proposal, and are they going to understand all the words that you have there? Are they going to really get it? Are you being overly cute when you use a play on words or something, or you use a long polysyllabic string of words? So I think one thing this experience is teaching us, this call to relevance right now in Congress, is that a large part of transparency and accountability is our responsibility to all be clearer in describing those things that are public. Now, you can be real detailed in the proposal and impress the reviewers. That's just great, okay? Because they're going to be looking for that detail in your competency. But but your titles and your abstracts do get put out online, and everybody can say, "Oh my gosh, what the heck does that mean?" So it's.
Hi, my name is Barbara Pearson from UMass Amherst, and Dr. Lesher brought up about the, in the aggregate, the sort of a big change for the broader impact community when that came out in the GPG. So I can sort of see how to do that for a center that they would have some kind of aggregate way of doing all their different activities. But I'm struggling with whether that has relevance for the individual PIs when they're just making something, or is that a requirement of the institution? That the interpretation of that.
So at the risk of identifying an individual institution, I was on a trip once to an unnamed institution in Madison, Wisconsin, and I was tremendously struck by a center that they had, I think it was called For Public Understanding or something, but it was a resource that the entire faculty was expected to do something with or near. Now, whether they did or not, we know many didn't, but there was an institutional resource there that would help people and help them fulfill the requirement. And I think that at the risk of inflaming institutions, really, there ought to be resources provided. And they don't have to be very elaborate. I thought Dr. Cordova's point, helping, and this ought to be the research administrators in universities, they should not allow proposals to go out that have them funny titles and the abstracts that will inflame somebody. That should not be allowed, and that does not take a lot of resource. But back to broader impacts, my own view is that it is an obligation of institutions to help.
So if you're in an institution that doesn't have it, we put in this thing
Well, NSF could, I mean, we could convene, if we haven't already, groups to put out something and have things online that would, I mean, there are other tools. It's great if your institution has it, and as Alan said, you should march over to your vice president for research and say, why don't we have this? But that's, but we can do a good job utilizing the web of putting out tools. I mean, this summit, for example, is about broader impacts, so there could be some pretty concise products from this summit, and I know the organizers will take that into account. And
we use things like Sure.
mm-hmm.
You contribute to a larger
Mm-hmm.
evaluation, but we don't know others, and they're not always relevant.
Mm-hmm.
So I just haven't known how to interpret it, and now I'm setting it straight.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about the individual. It's something we can work on.
Yeah, I think just to amplify your point, that, there's the language now that you mentioned that requires the institutions to provide, to certify that they are providing this support. It's part of the new language. But I think for those institutions that don't, to your point, that may not yet have such facilities, there's a struggle as to how to make the administrators aware of this, dare say, emerging responsibility. And I think there's a sentiment, and maybe we'll hear other questions along these lines, about the importance of signals from the funding agencies with respect to at least the broad set of expectations beyond just institutional support. I think there's sort of a gap between that language and the reality on the ground. And, as you know, university presidents and chancellors are very busy, and this is not necessarily something that's often the top of the list. And so I think that may be, an emerging need to just begin to clarify the intent behind that. Is that maybe sort of what you were saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we certainly can provide from this room and elsewhere emerging exemplars of how Wisconsin does it, or my campus, or many others around here. So there are some stories to tell, but again, we know that if the expectation is not clear, that everything follows the money, and then that's where you know, the rubber will hit the road. So do we, yeah, back in the back.
Hi, Jeff Bueller with Project Liftoff at the Missouri After School Network and University of Missouri Extension. Dr. Cordova, I wanted to thank you for recognizing the informal science education in the after-school hours. My question to both of you is, how can we use these out-of-school opportunities to communicate with the public, and to kind of participate in this education and community kind of co-discovery of relevance and really what's needed on both sides of our work?
Well, I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for informal education, because what inspired me to walk over to MIT and knock on a scientist's door was a public television special about neutron stars that featured an MIT scientist. So I'm a huge advocate, because lots and lots of young people live in places where scientists don't reach, and go to attend schools, grammar schools and high schools where scientists don't visit, and they have no role models, and they have no idea really what science is about. I've noticed from still watching public television that NSF is sponsoring more of it, and see a number of features, and it's just gotten better and better as the number of TV channels expands and so on. And of course, there are many other kinds. There are many museums and exploratoriums and all that people are taking advantage of around the country. So I think these are all it just can't be underestimated how important these are in touching lives that have no other kinds of resources. And I hope that NSF, to the extent that its budget allows, can foster some of these activities and at least be an advocate for them, and hopefully also get some partnerships going with others to leverage the small budget that we have for this activity, because I know there are industries and private individuals and foundations who are very, very passionate about this, and they'd like to see a good vision and some great models of where this worked. Everybody lives in a community, and it's actually the biggest communities that are hurting, some of them in different sectors of them the most. So I think it's just a great comment, but we're going to have to leverage what we have by working with others to do a better job.
Right? I don't have anything there.
So I am Judy Hallinan from Carnegie Mellon University, and I actually had a question for Dr. Leshner related to the task force on merit review, and it actually, a lot of these questions have kind of got to some of this. In looking at the numbers, 11,000 NSF proposals funded each year, average life of 3 years, so 33,000 broader impacts activities should be going on at this very minute. And I wonder if in this idea of continuing and letting these initiatives that are really the gems live, in the review of the merit review process, did you identify the things that Dr. Cordova was mentioning, the mechanisms that have been successful in continuing these great initiatives beyond the life of grants? Because people put a lot of time and energy into coming up with really unique and wonderful opportunities that then seem to either fade away, or again, the universities, when they're able to, pick up the responsibility. But are there ideas or mechanisms that are these things, that people can point to for how to continue the impact beyond the funded life of the grant?
So it wasn't really our charge to look at what's a good one or a not good one, or, we did not study broader impacts. We studied the review criteria. And so our approach was really the question, how's it being interpreted, how's it being reviewed? And I think it would be worthwhile at some point for NSF or somebody to look at the array of ways in which broader impacts is being implemented, and then what works and what doesn't work. Although I'm not totally sure I know what the criteria of what works might be, but, so we didn't do it.
And one of the activities of the new network, the Bionic Network that Susan announced last night, will be to curate some promising practices. I think it's a little bit premature to call them best practices yet, so we're calling them promising practices for now until we can catch up with a more systematic way of determining if they're best or not.
You know that once a year, NSF has a set of awards. In fact, that's coming up on May 6th for public service and outreach. And those are exemplars. They've been going on for some time. Those award winners, there's one on an individual level and then a team or group level. So think, exploratorium on a group level, and maybe, somebody, your favorite scientist that you see on television or hear a lot about and a lot of attention in magazines and so forth for the individual one. But it's, it's just a drop in the bucket of all this. Just a drop in the bucket, because I'm sure there are so many really wonderful models. I think it's just a really important question. How do we give some life to the things that really work and look at how those can be replicated, at least shared, so they have the opportunity to be replicated. So that'd be great.
And I think Dr. Ward suggested a little bit more even airtime on the NSF News site between the intellectual merit stories and the broader impact stories might be an easy, low-hanging fruit as a starting place for giving that some spotlights. I think we're in the back here.
Hi, Larry Bell from the Museum of Science in Boston. I want to pick up on Alan's point that our communication shouldn't be solely from the scientist to the public, but it should be two-way. We need to ask and listen to what the public has to say too. I have been in agreement, I've sold on this idea from 10 years ago when you talked about it at Association of Science and Technology Centers. And the question is, what can we, if people have thoughts about what this group can do to help affect that kind of change in the way we think of science communication, because it seems to me so obvious. Yes, it's fine that science has done these things for me in the past, but right now you're taking some money out of my pocket, out of my paycheck every week as a part of taxes and so on. What are you doing for me now? What is this money going to be used for? And do you care about what I want or what I need? I think that's kind of an idea of a transaction that would bring the public much more in line with what science is doing than simply communicating the other way. How can this group possibly help to affect that change?
I have an opinion, of course. I have an opinion on everything. I think that as a part of your messianic missionary activities about broader impacts, it's important to include the fact that scientists need an attitude cleanup, that in fact there's a great tendency among our colleagues to sort of think that it's beneath them to listen to the public. But I can tell you from just very personal experience that I have benefited tremendously from paying attention to some of the questions that I've been asked when I have either spoken about my own work historically or, more recently in science leadership positions. And a part of what you can do is in talking about broader impacts to include that it's a good idea to pay attention. First of all, the rest of the public is also smart, sort of shocking to some scientists. But A, that's true, and you can learn a great deal. And secondly, it is their concerns that we're trying to address often. And so we should be paying attention. But other than that, I don't have any great wisdom. But you know, you're the teachers, in a way, of what are we talking about and how do you go about it. And an important part of it is to emphasize the point that listening is good.
Yeah. And I think one other experience that many of us who work in the K-12 sector have come to recognize is, aside from the various sources of controversy that's continue to swirl around, nearly everybody agrees that giving their kids a better education is a good thing. And so whatever work we end up doing to support more interesting, engaging K-12 experiences, both in and out of school, certainly to your point about informal science, it's almost a universally recognized good. I mean, there are a couple of little areas where we might disagree, but it's a rallying flag, I think, and a lot of common ground, to your point, around how we could work together with the public in that space for their kids.
I am Catalina Akim. I am a professor of chemistry at Carnegie Mellon University too, and I am a rotator, a program director at NSF. So my question doesn't go to Dr. Cordova because I know better than ask my new boss. I have a comment actually regarding the promising practices that you are mentioning this conference may lead to and will be published. There is also a big difference in panels and also for scientists writing proposals in the way that we have a quantitative assessment of the intellectual merit and broader impact, and that may distinguish, how the two are approached in a proposal or a project of larger amplitude. And I think besides promising practices, if we could have a set of very basic, commonly applicable tools for assessment, distributed either in writings or through electronic means that people could adopt easily, I think that would be a great contribution both for teaching people how to write the proposals, putting those tools in the hands of panelists for review, and also in what we do at NSF to assess the impact and long-term consequences of the broader impact.
Yeah. Where's Jamie?
I knew that.
So Jamie Bell runs the Center for Informal Science, Advancing Informal Science. And in my view, one of the best exemplars of a resource like that. Do you want to say something about your evaluation database, Jamie, real quick?
Yes, thank you, and thanks to NSF for funding the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education for the past 6+ years. We are trying to be a resource that aggregates as much about evaluation, that is to say evaluation reports, instruments, and what's being learned from evaluation in informal settings. There's about 8,000 records in the repository now, always growing. We just relaunched the site not quite a year ago, and continue now with a digital librarian actually on staff who's really cleaning up and making sure that all the metadata categories are right and aligned to what people might be looking for and are accessible. Now, I want to emphasize again, that's in the informal realm, but we think there's a great need there for credibility and evidence of the type that we're trying to aggregate and make accessible.
Yeah. So when we put together the RCN proposal to fund this, we looked at Jamie's resource as a model, and so we hope to not copy it per se, but to emulate the work that they've done for their community as part of our emerging website, and we would welcome your ideas and contributions along those lines, absolutely. Of course, to your point, Jamie, it takes curation and resources to do that, so we'll be back for more money soon.
I thought you were going to say, so Jamie, we're all depending on you. And, don't mess it up.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sriram Sundarajan. I'm a faculty in mechanical engineering at Iowa State. and I recently took over the Broader Impacts platform for the Iowa EPSCoR project. So I had a similar question, kind of a follow-up to the previous question, which is related to the review process itself. So when programs go through accreditation, like ABET, et cetera, things like that, some things are ambiguous too, but when there are clear assessment tools such as rubrics, for example, it helps the faculty who are delivering the programs know exactly what to do. So I wonder if in the review process for the proposals, especially for the broader impacts criterion, whether there has been any consideration of establishing explicit rubrics that basically tie to some core principles that you're looking for in the broader impacts criterion, which can then help inform the people who are writing the proposals to then establish better plans and follow through and so on. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that approach, whether it's already been tried or whether for my own information.
Yeah. Let me just redirect that to Dr. Ward, who I think actually said something directly to that point about why they took the list off of the website this morning. So do you want, if it's okay with you?
Oh, I would have done the same thing.
Okay,
Thank
good. I'm glad we're on the same page.
Basically, one of the things that was pointed out, and Dr. Leshner mentioned it on a number of occasions, NSF expressly did not want to be too prescriptive in constraining what people selected to do, and looking at the possibility of innovative approaches to this very burgeoning area, if you will. In the past, people thought NSF wants us to do all of these laundry lists of things, and that was very confusing and probably diminished the quality of broader impacts proposals, aspect of the proposals sent in. And as was pointed out this morning, there are FAQs posted on the NSF website that specifically says that NSF does not provide the articulation of all of these examples. But what is encouraging that's coming from the community is that you do have some repositories of examples from the PIs that are here.
I don't think I was necessarily asking about specific things to do, but whatever you do, I expect that you want to have a plan in place, are resources there in place, is there an assessment plan for your model in place? So if you can have some kind of basic guidelines for that, then that helps even in the review process for people to be consistent in reviewing it.
Yeah.
And so then that can help inform people as well. So that was
We'll take that under advisement.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and there is a kind of a fine line to balance there, and I think those of us who look at the standards for K-12 can see that there are often unintended consequences that even the best intentioned efforts sometimes get twisted. So,
hello, I'm Michelle Dudash. I am a faculty member at University of Maryland, and I'm a rotator at NSF right now. And I wanted to reflect on something I heard this morning and what you just said about signals. And we have not revised our budget or our budget justification and how we have our PIs put it together for a few decades. And it might be that we want to think about breaking it apart from intellectual merit and broader impacts, because there was a discussion this morning about resources and how much of your budget can go towards broader impacts. And then it was, someone else pointed out, that we are mentoring is broader impacts in our REU program and our ET program, and maybe if we made it more straightforward and people could appreciate what they were doing, they could think about mentoring components, outreach components, and so forth. So this would be like a signal to the community. Thank you.
You make me think that it would be going back to my comment about twittering about not having a town hall, maybe I should have a town hall with rotators, and they can all give each other and the rest of us listening some great advice. That's very interesting what you said, but I'd like to hear a lot of voices on observations like yours. Thank you.
okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then Dr. Leshner and Dr. Cordova, if you have any kind of last thoughts that might have been percolating, we'll save a couple minutes for you at the end.
Susan Carter from the University of California, Merced. Thank you. It's been very stimulating to hear the discussion. I wanted to follow up on this idea of assessment and idea of signals and maybe back up even a step further than that, which is I wonder if part of the issue that we're struggling with is what I believe would be the so what in your triangle that you had on your slide, which is what are the outcomes that we really want? That, in other words, assessment of these programs is a great idea, but do we have a clear understanding as to what the outcome is that would be beneficial, that would separate what's good from what's bad? And the whole concept of benefiting in society is such a broad one, and we have different ideas as to what's beneficial, as I think the presentations also pointed out. But I'm wondering if there's been any consideration or discussion of giving signals about what would be a good societal impact.
I don't know that I know the right answer to that.
Yeah. I mean, you did have a comment about your language versus the Capete's language.
It's the same thing. I think Wanda Ward's point that you don't want to get very prescriptive. And so I think it's difficult for PIs. I do. I think it's difficult not to be prescriptive. But I think ultimately what we want to do is be assured that the science that we support is being supported in a broad societal context with an understanding that the purpose of the science is ultimately to benefit humankind. And there are lots of ways it can do that, and lots of ways it can be tied to it. So if that's not the right answer, I probably didn't understand the question.
I think that's the problem, is the PIs don't necessarily, that's I think the question that they struggle with is, I want to have good outcomes, but I'm not sure what that means when it's not descriptive.
So I never heard of Bionic before about 2 hours ago, and I, to be candid, didn't know there was a group like this or that many people who were involved in doing the kinds of work that you all do. You are actually the solution to the problem. I'm serious. Thank you, but I actually believe that. I think this is how we're going to get a handle on this. And frankly, there's an unnamed person who lives on a hill who needs to know that there are these people in the scientific community who are dedicated to making sure that the work is going to have a broader context and a broader impact. So here to you.
Any final thoughts?
That was my final thought.
Dr. Cordova?
So your question also reminded me that, having a good outcome of having one's proposal accepted is a continuous process of improvement. And it depends not just on yourself, but on getting really good input from others. So I'll give you, because I've been a university president a couple of times and been in research head and that sort of thing, and written proposals, not all of them successful. I have some perspective on what kind of partnerships it takes around the campus to really be successful. And you're at a brand new university, Ms. Merced, or Dr. Merced, so you can be a role model for how to do this. But I found that when you have a research development person on campus, okay, that would be you, invaluable to help people understand that we need a broader impact in this. This is, an example, and keep them thinking. I'll give you one example that really made an impression on me. So, as you know, one of the roles of university administrators is to promote young faculty for these significant awards. It gives them a real boost to their career, and even the most senior faculty for career awards and so on. So how do you write a really a winning proposal for that person that you absolutely know their research is making a difference or is going to make a huge difference. Well, that is a very collaborative process. So I have seen come from my department, this is many departments ago, some proposal from, so it starts with the scientist, the young scientist who writes about their research, and everybody goes, oh my gosh, you know, I don't understand this. Everybody's sitting around a table. What are we going to do with this? We know she's great. She's making these amazing discoveries, but she doesn't know how to explain what she's doing, what it means and the significance. And so everybody kind of takes a hand in it. And by the time that whole process is done, it communicates, it talks to people. It has a heart, it has a beginning, you know, a story, then it has all the content and an ending of the impact. And so I mention this because this is not the process that Alan's described, that we're all talking about, is not real simple. It is one of those interdisciplinary things. And there's, it's going to take a whole village to make a proposal successful, to make a person successful, and to learn these kind of skills where you not only make a difference, but you can communicate well that you're making a difference. So I urge all of us to think about how we can sharpen that up and make sure that our folks, our scientists, get that kind of help and support on our campuses.
Well, I want to just close this session by thanking first all of you in the audience for really a sustained dialogue with our panelists and our keynoters today, and to commit that the messages that you all want to surface will be carried forward to Dr. Ward and to Dr. Cordova at the NSF. And so please think of this as just the first opportunity to begin that two-way communication. Again, as Dr. Cordova takes the helm at NSF, and we give her a chance to get her bearings in terms of all of the intricacies. But please continue to keep those questions, those messages, the good suggestions that we've heard today, because we're all in the trenches, and we can learn incredibly valuable insights, avoid repeating each other's missteps and mistakes if we can share and then collect and then communicate that in a digestible format for our sponsors here at the NSF. And we pledge with all of you to continue to do that on your behalf and on all of our behalf. So with that, please again thank Dr. Cordova and Dr. Leshner for their comments today.